So I learned something last week that I thought I knew to be true, but I mean, you just never know. It's just one of those things like you feel like you know it, but you don't really know it until you know it. And last week confirmed what I thought I knew, and now I for sure know. And that is this, that sex sells. Last week was our highest attended Sunday that we've had in like 4 months. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, and which is wild because it was on the end of a holiday, right? Schools were out, and so it was the end of holiday, and we did that intentionally, thinking, that's going to give parents the greatest opportunity not to have their kids here, like that's for sure, kids will be gone. And so that was intentional on our end. Nevertheless, on a holiday weekend last week, it was just through the roof, and that just proves what everybody always says, and so that was a nice confirmation. That was really good. We did have a few child casualties last week. Just a few that had to get up, and it happens, right? It just happens. I mean, it's one of those moments where, it's just, I started last week, we just, right out of the gun, we just ran into it. And so there was not a lot of warning or time, and so shots were fired, and children went running. It was good. It was great. It was great. I'm not here today to talk about week 3, though. I'm here to talk about relationship killer number 4. And to do that, I want to tell you a story that's not a story. Well, I guess it is a story, but it's a true story. It's a historical retelling, I guess, about a man by the name of Leonardo da Vinci and a painting called the Mona Lisa. He finished it just about 500 years ago or so. Nobody's sure exactly when, but somewhere between, early 1500s, before 1517 is kind of when most folks are like, hey, he's done with it before then. After Leonardo da Vinci passed away, everyone saw that the Mona Lisa, like, this is special. And so after he passed away, he had an apprentice that actually took possession of the painting, and he took possession of it, and he was like, hey, I got this bad boy, and that didn't last very long. King Francis of France actually then took possession from the apprentice and said, hey, here's the deal. I want this displayed, and so this French king put it in the palace of Fontainebleau. That was a good French accent. I don't know if y'all are tracking with me on how good that was, but it was good. Shortly after that, a good while after that, Louis XIV moved the Mona Lisa from that place into the Palace of Versailles. It remained there all the way up until the French Revolution. In 1800, Napoleon, he decided, you know what? He's sitting in his bedroom, and there's a wall with a blank space, and he says, you know what would look good hanging in my bedroom? The Mona Lisa. And so Napoleon goes and he gets it, and sure enough, I don't know if he just takes like a drywall anchor and just nails that bad boy up and hangs it there and tries to get it level. I'm not sure how it happens, but if you're Napoleon, you can do what you want, I guess. And so he had it hanging in his bedroom for 4 years. In 1911, there was a guy that was brought into the Louvre, and he was doing some glass work on some other little pieces of art, and he realized the opportunity. And so he was doing his glass work, and the day came to a close, and so he found a closet, and he hid in the closet. And once everyone was gone, he came out of his hiding spot, and he took the Mona Lisa. I don't know if he put it under his arm or in a bag, but he walked out with it. And it was missing for 2 years. Other folks thought that other famous artists had actually stolen it because they wanted their art to get the recognition, and it wasn't getting. So they actually went and arrested other people, right? Like, hey, here it is. But they never thought about this other guy. Eventually, this guy tries to sell it 2 years later, and he gets caught selling it. And it gets returned. It's been in the United States because of the Kennedys. 40,000 people a day went and saw the Mona Lisa. It still holds the Guinness Book of World Records for the top most insured item in terms of how much it's worth that you can put a number to. No one argues that it's the most famous painting in all the world. They struggled with putting a value on it, but you had to have some dollar figure if it were to get damaged, stolen, or destroyed. So it has the top dollar. No piece of art worth more than the Mona Lisa. On August 2nd, 2009, there was a woman from Russia who was trying to get her French nationality and qualifying for that, and she found out that morning she did not qualify. And So she was not going to get what she was after. And so she went to the Louvre and goes to the museum gift store, and she buys a mug. Probably says like, I Heart Paris, I don't know, something on it. She takes it and she puts it in her purse, and she goes into the room where the Mona Lisa is hanging on the wall. And she stares at it for a little bit. And then she reaches into her purse and she hurls it over the heads of people, straight out of the painting. Boom. She must have been a pitcher in college or something, I don't know. Nailed it. Problem was, there's a sheet of bulletproof glass that was in front of the painting. So it came inches away from doing some pretty serious damage, but it just hit the glass. Of course, the mug shattered in a couple hundred pieces. She was arrested. You see, she had a problem that she couldn't talk to the right people about solving. And when she couldn't figure out how to talk to the right people about solving her problem, she did what all of us do so often. She said, how can I hurt them most? How could I hurt France most? And so she threw a mug at it. Much like marriage. You see, the fourth relationship killer is communication. The ability for us to have some conversations. But instead, so often, we end up just throwing mugs at the things that matter most to the people we're angry and frustrated with. 4 weeks ago, we started this series on relationship killers, and I'm going to start week 4 the same way we started the first 3. We have an incredible description of a healthy marriage that's given to us in the Bible, in the book of Ephesians, and in it there are 4 key words that are secrets to every single healthy marriage. So if you haven't been here for the first 3 weeks, I'm going to read it to you. It's a pretty chunky little piece of passage here. And so I'm going to read it to you. I want you, if you haven't been here for the first 4 weeks, to try to pick out here what are the 4 key words. If you've been here, then hopefully this is a refresher. Hopefully you're thinking of the 4 words before I get there. I'm going to just bust through it as quick as I can. But here is the secret if you are interested in a healthy marriage. It's in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21 through 33. We've got to know what a healthy marriage looks like so that we can work on the relationship killer piece. Verse 21. He says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your own husbands as you do to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church, his body of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. 4 secrets to healthy marriage. Number 1, it's in the very first line, Jesus. Right? So he says, hey, everything I'm going to ask you to do here, out of reverence for Christ, in other words, he uses the word Christ, but we know he's talking about Jesus. In other words, we're going to ask the question, is Jesus in the lead? So when we have an argument, when we have a disagreement, when we're talking about a purchase, when we're talking about how we're going to spend our time, whatever those things are, we're asking that question, is Jesus in the lead in this decision? Secret number 2, submission. Now, what's interesting about submission is that he talks about submission equally, and then he does an overemphasis, specifically wife towards husband. He doesn't overemphasize submission, husband towards wife, but he does overemphasize wife in the direction of a husband. There's an overemphasis in submission. 3rd, love. Now, here's the interesting thing, is that there's an enormous overemphasis, husband towards wife. They don't even mention wife loving the husband. I don't guess you have to love your husband. That's not a problem. They just doesn't even mention it. It's not even a requirement. But for sure, multiple times, in fact, half of the entire passage I just read is all about telling a husband how to love his wife. It's over and over and over again, like we're thick-headed people or something. I don't know. So we have Jesus in the lead, submission, overemphasis, wife towards husband, love, overemphasis, husband towards wife, and the fourth one is respect. Jesus, submission, love, and respect. It's not rocket science. It's not that like, oh man, and now we know how to do it, right? So the question is, how does communication, the fourth relationship killer, how does it kill submission, love, respect, and Jesus being in the lead? Well, the truth is, when we look at communication, if we back up to the previous 3 weeks, we can see that all of the issues that we have can actually be talked about and that we can problem solve together. So week 1, we talked about time, that time is a relationship killer. And typically it's the misuse of it, or we don't realize that our lives are zero-sum, that every yes to something is a no to something else. Oftentimes we don't realize that because it's a silent no. It was an out loud yes, commitment, but a silent no of saying, well, now I don't have time to do this other thing. And so when we begin to look at our time as zero-sum, we begin to realize that we're giving a lot of time away to things that are not the most important to us. Now, a lot of times we're giving time away to something that is really important in our thought process to keeping what's most important to us happy, like our husband or our wife or our kids or whatever, and it's extra jobs and it's extra hours. But before you know it, you run out of weekends and you have no other time to spend or invest in the people you actually care about. But you have enough money now to do it. You just don't have the time. But you can talk about those things. You can communicate it. You can set healthy boundaries. You can say, hey, here's the deal. This is what we want. This is what we won't do. We will go without this financially so that we have more time because we realize that time is actually more valuable than money. You can talk about it. Week 2, we talked about money being the second relationship killer, that it can either make you miserable or it can make things memorable. And that so often our time or our mind is wrapped around the amount of money depends on whether we're miserable or memorable. But that's not the truth. It doesn't matter if you've got everything you've ever dreamed of in terms of your bank account or you got nothing you dream of. The memorable or miserable piece isn't about amounts. It's about unity in the two of you together. But the two of you together can get through anything. Week 3, we talked about have sex. And we specifically talked about how you don't have enough of it if you're married. And issues that happen that keep it from happening. But you can talk about those things. You can talk about time. You can talk about money. You can talk about sex. You can create a plan. You can have a conversation about all those things. All of that is communication. But how do you do that? I mean, you just open your mouth and words come out? How is communication a relationship killer? I'd say it kills relationships in 3 very specific ways. I'm going to go through these quickly. The first one is there's not enough of it. There's just not enough communication, right? There's just not enough communication where there's some expectations that are often unspoken. It doesn't mean that they're not there. It just means they're not talked about. Like I got this expectation in my head of how I want you to act or how I want you to go about this or how I want you to handle this particular situation, but I've never said it out loud to you. I just think that you should know. So there's not enough communication. Or we talk about things, but we can't quite get into the depth of it. We stay surface level because the anger gets the best of us, and before we know it, we're talking about something that has nothing to do with what we're actually arguing about, but this was easier to yell about. And so that's where we go. The second issue, if it's not enough communication, it's the wrong approach to communication, right? The wrong approach altogether. Third one, lack of clarity. We thought we were crystal clear. Yet the person receiving the information did not receive it as clear as you think it was. Not enough, the wrong approach, lack of clarity. Here's our excuses for this. Well, we say, well, that's just how I am, right? That's just how I am. That's how I handle things. My default is this. I'm a fighter. I'm not going to flight nothing. I'm not going to run away. I'm going to fight. This is who I am. This is how I was born to be. Or we get a coffee mug or a shirt, that's got something like, hey, if you don't like me, you can just kick rocks, right? This is who I am. I ain't changing, right? I can't remember the pithy little slogan that you put on there. I think it was Marilyn Monroe said it. I don't know. People, I see it all the time. People put on their Facebook wall this little meme, and it's like, just here I am, whatever. I'm not changing for nobody because this is who I am. That kind of thing. You know, I get it. Man. Second excuse we got is what's clear to me ought to be clear to her. Or what's clear to me ought to be clear to him. He should just know this. She should just know this. Or there's just certain topics that bring out the worst in me, right? Like when I'm fine, but when we want to talk about this, I just can't talk about this. This thing right here, I just can't do it. I can't handle it. I can talk about anything else, but I can't talk about this. Or we just say, you know what, when I talk to him or talk to her, it's just like talking to a brick wall. When I have couples sit in my office and they're having, crisis thing, just in case any of y'all ever come sit with me and one of you say this, just know this is happening in my head when you say this out loud. When you say, when I talk to him, and it's usually her talking about him, but when I talk to him, it's like I'm talking to a brick wall. Immediately, I picture her standing in front of a brick wall, yelling at it. Like, that's what I do. Like, if you just picture, I'm not going to ask you to do that, Aaron, but, just go over to a brick wall. And have you ever just pictured someone just standing at a brick wall, just screaming at it, like telling it to do things, Pick up your underwear! Like the brick wall's just standing there still. You know what I'm saying? It's good. It helps relieve a little tension as they're getting at it. How do we make this relationship killer a relationship giver? How do we do that? Well, I think it begins by taking a look at two things involved in communication: the sender and the receiver. And if we can do work on the sender and the receiver, then communication honestly does have a shot. So let's start with the sender for a second. Let me start with a couple of really good questions that I think we should all answer internally for ourselves. The first one is this: who are you? Who's communicating? Who are you? I don't mean like first, middle initial, and last name. I think you know that. But I mean, honestly, who are you? Have you ever done an exercise where you've taken out a little notepad and a pen or a pencil, or be honest, if your mom of young kids, a crayon? Have you ever just written down what kind of husband you want to be? Or what kind of wife you really want to be? Have you ever done that for yourself? Like you just say, you know what, I'm going to write it down. Like I'm not going to say this is who I am, but this is who I want to be. And then have you ever sat a moment and taken a look at that list and just kind of walked through it? Who are you? And when you make that list, do you realize that maybe the way you communicate, that you're communicating from the person you think you want to be and not the person you actually are? Where if you were to communicate and you were actually the person you put down on paper, that it'd probably be received a little bit differently. But the truth is, it's coming from someone that's not that person at the moment. And so it's received not as that person, but from the person that you actually are. It's not just who you are, but it's also what's your purpose. What do you want to accomplish? Because how you communicate matters. Here's a really good question. Do you want to win the argument, or do you want to win your spouse? Do you want to win the argument, or do you want to win your spouse? In other words, is being on the front page more important to you than being on the same page? Now here's the deal. And the way my brain works is I'm often very black and white. Like it's just cut and dry. I'm very logical, and I can compartmentalize, and I can make a decision and not be emotional about it, and just close the lid on that and move on and say, okay, well now I'm as clear-headed as I'm going to be to make the next decision. I'm fine. I've dealt with that. It's over. I'm done. Right? And so when I have a conversation with my wife, or a lot of times that's how I think. Right? Okay, this is easy. We really don't have to put that many words into this. It's really a lot easier than that. Right? But I also realize that, again, what's my point? Do I really just want to be right? No. I want to be right with her. Like, I don't want to win this battle and stand on the top with my flag planted at the top of this hill that I just decided I would die on alone. Like, I want her to be on the hill with me. In other words, being right isn't actually enough for me. And so I realized that sometimes there are moments when I just have to say, you know what? If I plant my flag today, there's zero chance she's coming up here with me. So I've got to lose today. What's your purpose? Now, the truth is, and this is really important because how matters, right? How you communicate matters. The truth is the who leads to the how. Like, who you are is going to lead to how you communicate. And so if you're constantly finding an issue where, hey, there's a breakdown in how I do it, the first question you need to figure out is, hey, how do I do this differently, but how do I change who I am? Because from who you are, that's how you will communicate. Now, there are still moments, right? There are still moments when it's like, well, you know, I've gotten better as a person, right? I feel like I'm a better who, like the who am I, that's good. And I still communicate in a way that devalues someone, or is disrespectful, or is just angry, those kind of things. And so in that moment, it's like, man, I'm not even living up to the expectations I have for myself, you know? But here's the thing, and while, again, just because you got the who figured out doesn't mean the how will always be flawless. However, what it does mean is that when the how is, there's a mistake there, when it is very much flawed, the ability to say, I'm sorry, and I got it wrong, comes quicker. Because you realize you don't need someone to correct you. You're realizing as it's coming out of your mouth, this is not me. This is not who I want to be. And so you have the opportunity then to say, you know what, am I going to let pride talk myself out of making this right, or am I going to do what I already know is right and make this right? The better the who is, the better the how will be. And the quicker the apology and the response to make things right when the how is broken. You know, when we talk about the sender and the who and the how, that determines the what's being sent. The little brother of Jesus actually talks a little bit about this in his letter. He wrote in James 1:26, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. He's saying, hey, in other words, he sees such an enormous link in the chain, like a connection between who we are as people. He even goes into your religion. If you're going to claim to be a follower of Jesus, yet out of your mouth is going to come all kind of things that are not controlled and that you communicate in a way that doesn't reflect being a follower of Jesus. He's saying what you think about yourself is actually worthless because this is the proof of what you actually are. You know? He's saying that's just it. He gets it, that the who is where everything starts. And the how and the what feed off of that or feed from that. In other words, good communication is controlled communication. Good communication is controlled communication. So we don't do things where we say, hey, I just get so angry that I fill in the blank. Before you know it, you're throwing your slippers out the front door. The truth is, that wasn't from personal experience. Oh boy. The truth is that we know that we've got to be intentional with the way we communicate. Our third value here at Foundation is on-purpose relationships. And that's on purpose with those that are in our life, but also on purpose with Jesus. And what we know for sure is that we don't drift into healthy and good relationships. You've got to be on purpose about it, which means you've got to be on purpose with the way you communicate because it's a reflection of the who. So when I get to sit with couples that are in crisis or pre-marriage, I've got some marriage rules that I've put together. I've got 5 of them. I want to share a couple of them with you this morning because they deal very closely with communication. The first one, well, it's actually rule number 2, but the first one I'm going to share with you, it's really simple. And I share these probably once or twice a year in some form or fashion. So if you don't get them, just hang around 6-7 months and I'll bring them up some other time. Rule number 2 is you never call them a name, right? So that's a really simple one. You're like, oh, man, that doesn't seem like kindergarten? You would think, right? You'd think. But I've sat in the office sometimes and they've gone back and forth calling names, and it's like, that's really creative. Like, I'm going to write that one down. Not that I could use it, but just in case, I'm making like a dictionary of awesome sauce. That could go in there. That's really creative. But the truth is that what science has discovered is that our brains respond to our own name more than any other word in the language that we speak in a positive way. And so when we substitute some negative name, something that brings us down, where we would typically use our name, it has the inverse effect. So with premarital couples, I tell them, hey, my hope for you is that you invite me to your 25th year wedding anniversary, and that you can stand up in front of everybody and say, hey, for the last 25 years, we have not ever called one another a name. That there's not been any disrespect or anything that was disparaging, that when I addressed her, when I addressed him, I thought about who she was, who he was, and we just didn't do that, right? Now, I wish I could say that for my own marriage. It's not true. So if you rewind about 11 years ago, I messed that up for us. I'll never forget where we were. We were on the interstate on 75 coming out of Atlanta, coming south. And we were right at the Hateville exit. For those of you who know, the original Dwarf House is there. Ford factory used to be there. And there's a McDonald's next to a hotel. And on the left side, there's some brick buildings that as a kid, I never knew what it was, but I thought they made nuclear bombs there. But that's not the case, from what I understand. It just looked like it. There was always smokestacks and things on the side. And anyway, so we were right there on the interstate. And I was so mad. I don't even remember what we were angry about. I don't remember what we were arguing about. I just know I looked at her, and out of my mouth, and I called her that, that name, starts with a B, that kind of thing. And it just, boom, there it was. And there it was. And so I ruined that ability for us to have that, And so now we fast forward, 11 years now, and we're on track. But I really do wish that for couples. Marriage is all about long game, And it's about simple things. And what we know is that when we make mistakes, they just stack up on one another. And if we don't have good communication, that stack gets pretty big. And then the smallest name in just a blink of an eye moment can cause that whole stack to come tumbling over. And when things fall over, debris gets everywhere. And a lot of times people don't want to put the work in to clean up the debris. They would just rather sell it and buy a new one. So that's rule number 2. Rule number 4. Rule number 4 is that if you're in the middle of it, like, boom, pal, look at them now, here we go, and you're just getting at it with each other, not week 3 getting at it, but like week 4, yelling and arguing, that you can, because for sure this is not good in week 3. You can call a timeout. No timeouts in week 3, okay? Once you start, you know what I'm saying? But when you're having those arguments, you can call a timeout. Now, it's important that the number 4, rule number 4 cannot be used unless you also adhere to rule number 5. And so rule number 4 is you can call a timeout in the midst of it. Like you're having at it and you're going to town and you're yelling and screaming at each other. And then someone's like, you know what, I'm going to call a timeout. And the other person's probably going to say something like, you would call a timeout right now because I'm about to just throw the hammer down. This is the point I was about to make. And then you get to say, no, I'm going to do it because I don't want to break rule number 2. And so then there's a little bit of like, okay, I got it. You're about to call me. What were you going to call me? I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say it because we're in a timeout. However, you can't use rule number 4 unless you use rule number 5, which is my timeout's going to last this long. Right? Like, hey, I need a break. But we're going to time back in an hour. Right? So it's not this, I'm going to time out and I'm done. I can't talk about this anymore. So time out and you'll be just Zach Morris the rest of your life. You know, they do TV timeout. He gets to walk around. Like, you can't do that. But it's, hey, I'm going to take a time out. I'm going to take a time out. And in 2 hours, let's pick up the discussion. I don't want to break rule number 2. And honestly, I don't feel like we're getting anywhere, and I need to reorganize my thoughts because clearly what I'm communicating to you isn't actually what I want, because I want us to take the hill together and plant the flag together. And at this moment, it feels like we're just tearing the hill down together, you know? Now, there's another sender issue in addition to these, and that issue is it's not so much that we say too much or say things that we didn't mean. Sometimes the issue isn't that we say things that we don't mean, it's that we don't say everything we do mean, right? Sometimes the issue isn't that we say things we don't mean, it's that we don't say everything we do mean. Now, I don't remember where I got this from, but it stuck with me. It's the principle of the last 10%. Hey, you know, you have a conversation, you're having a discussion, and then you decide, you know what, we've been talking about this for an hour. I've got 90% of what I needed to talk about this on. But for sure, the last 10% is a doozy, and it's going to add a couple more hours of conversation, and I'm exhausted. So I'm just going to keep this to myself. I'm going to put it in my pocket. I'm going to pretend like we've resolved this. However, next time I have an opportunity to yell at him, I'm going to be yelling at him for what's in my pocket, though he thinks it's because I'm yelling at him about the towel on the floor, right? Like, that's what he thinks, but he has no idea it's in my pocket. It's the last 10%. It's the, hey, there's one more thing. There's one more piece to this. There's one more thing that I just got to make sure that you know. It's that type of conversation. It's like, hey, we've made a lot of progress. This is good. We've made a lot of progress. However, there's just one more thing. When we talk about the receiver, the brother of James says this on receiving communication. James 1:19, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Now, the incredible thing about receiving communication, the person who receives the communication is actually the one with all the power. Every time. The person that receives the communication is the one with all the power. You see, the person who gives the communication, the sender, they're done. They've already sent what they've sent. They can do nothing now. So now you're in the place where you get to decide, do I continue to follow their lead if they gave me unhealthy communication? Am I going to give them power because the power is in your hands, whether you're going to follow that or not? Or are you going to lead them in a different way of communicating? And the power is yours. You get to decide. They've made their decision. Now you get to decide. Proverbs 15:1 says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Response is power. But we might say, well, does poor communication on their end, doesn't that give us a pass on our poor communication back? If they break rule number 2, shouldn't I be able to break rule number 2? After all, we start back over at day 0 anyway, right? Like, let me get some. I've been storing these up. I've learned them from my friends. Proverbs 15:18 says, a hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient calms a quarrel. The last thing we want to do when we're having poor communication is be patient or be told to be patient. The truth is, though, Proverbs 15:28, the heart of the righteous weighs its answers, but the mouth of the wicked gushes evil. Now that might seem harsh, like, whoa. So you're saying that now I'm evil and I'm wicked? What do you think is behind the moments in our marriage that tear them apart? When we have poor communication, sometimes we just chalk that up to a bad day, but the truth is, if that's something that tears your marriage apart, let's call it what it is. It's evil. Now, it might not be that when we say, hey, who are we? We might not be the evil part, but we allowed ourselves to be used by evil. Because for sure, God doesn't put anything in our marriage He's not tearing marriages apart, ripping those things up, tearing those to pieces. No. Evil's the one that's attacking marriage. Evil's the one that's going after it, saying, hey, let's split these people up. Let's tear these things apart. Let's separate these families. That's what evil's doing. God's not doing that. It's important, I think, when we realize, we talked about it week 1. Well, no, we talked about it last week. I don't know when we talked about it. We talked about it. That there's marriage and then there's marriage. And not all marriage is marriage. That sometimes there's people that get married and they stand before somebody in a bow tie or a tie and a fancy suit, and they exchange vows and they kiss each other and give a ring, and then they go have a fancy party and they're married. But not all marriage is marriage, because sometimes two people stand in front of each other, same fancy tie, same party at the end, but it's not just the two of them they exchange vows with. They invite God into it. And they say, hey, it's not just going to be between two of us, it's going to be between three of us. So we're going to ask God to be a part of this. And when that happens, there's no doubt that the things that try to tear that apart are trying to undo God's promises. It ain't just about the promises you made. But if Satan makes God someone who doesn't keep his promise, then God is no longer God. I want to give you a visual that hopefully this will make the most sense of anything I've said this morning. I'm going to read it to you out of the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 10. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Now you might think, hey, when I read that, that's not a very big visual, you know? In the original language, the Greek word for handiwork is poema, which we get the word poem from. And most folks, that's just where they stop. But the truth is poema means that it's not a poem. Even though we get the word poem, it kind of throws it off in our minds. But poema means something that's carefully crafted by a craftsman by his own hands. An even better way to put it would be it's a masterpiece. In other words, we are God's Mona Lisa. But the problem is that we don't have bulletproof glass hanging in front of us. We're just exposed. You know, I think when we engage in this communication, the best thing that we can do is to look at the eyes of the person across from us and realize they're God's masterpiece. And if we could see them like the Mona Lisa, then we would probably handle it with a little more care. Now here's the truth about Mona Lisa. If you get close enough to it, you can see in the upper right-hand corner there's a crack in it. It's starting to pull apart. The frame is warped. Now, if you flip it over on the back, there's a few pictures out there. They've got some butterfly little pieces that's trying to hold it together. In fact, there's still some damage on it that they've restored pretty well, but someone poured some acid on it. And the truth is, if you ask most art people, they'll tell you that they don't think the Mona Lisa's finished. That they never got around to finishing it. That it's incomplete. That sounds really familiar to me. A masterpiece that actually isn't perfect. It's got a bit of brokenness in it. That other people in its past have abused and done things to it that are not right. That's for sure unfinished. But the truth is, the value is through the roof and then some. Now, the good news is that if you really want to see the Mona Lisa, the best way to see it is without bulletproof glass. To actually get right up on it. But you can't do that anymore. When we're in a relationship, the best way to see one another is not behind glass, but face to face. In good communication. We say, you know what? There's a hill in front of us that we're fighting over. But at the end of the day, what I hope is that the two of us are on the top of the hill planting a flag together, not separate. And because you don't have bulletproof glass in front of you, I'm going to make sure that I'm not throwing anything at you. Mugs, slippers, you name it. Those are going to stay where they're supposed to stay. How do you see your spouse? Think about it right now. How do you see them? Are they God's masterpiece to you? Because here's the truth. Even if they're not, they still are. Even if they're not, they still are. So if you want to figure out how to make sure the 4 relationship killers become relationship givers, the key here, start with Jesus. And Jesus always starts with you. Who are you? Start with you. Who are you? And when you really begin to understand who you are, you will recognize the masterpiece that's standing in front of you. And it is my hope that you begin to treat, and see, and speak to, and plan your time around someone that's that valuable. Deal?